The clock approached 3 o'clock hours, June 6, 1944. Along the coast of Normandy, the night air felt unusually still, broken only by the distant rhythm of waves striking concrete fortifications. Inside a German radar bunker perched above the cliffs, operators leaned over glowing screens, their faces washed in pale green light. For months, these instruments had promised certainty, early warning, control, order. But tonight, the signals behaved differently. Blips appeared, multiplied, then dissolved into static. Lines stretched across the scope like drifting ghosts. Operators adjusted frequencies, checked connections, and exchanged uncertain glances. The machines were working. Yet the sky beyond them seemed suddenly unknowable. Far out over the English Channel, thousands of engines moved through darkness in disciplined formation. American bombers advanced steadily toward occupied France, hidden behind clouds, electronic interference, and carefully planned deception. To the crews inside those aircraft, dawn meant survival or fire. To the defenders below, it meant confusion without explanation. Before a single landing craft touched the beaches, before the first soldier stepped onto sand, the battle for Normandy had already begun in silence, inside the airwaves themselves. By early 1944, the war in Europe had entered a decisive phase. Nearly 5 years after Germany's rapid victories reshaped the continent, the balance of power was slowly reversing. The Allied nations had survived their darkest years. Industry in the United States operated at unprecedented capacity, Britain remained unconquered, and the Soviet Union pushed relentlessly westward after halting German expansion in the east. The question was no longer whether Western Europe would be invaded. Only when and where. France, occupied since 1940, had become the central fortress of German defensive strategy. Adolf Hitler believed the next Allied move would determine the survival of the Reich itself. Along the western coastline, engineers and forced laborers constructed an immense defensive network known as the Atlantic Wall. Stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, it consisted of reinforced bunkers, artillery batteries, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and coastal guns positioned to destroy any invasion fleet before it reached land. To German planners, the wall represented certainty. If the enemy could be detected early enough, reserves could be moved rapidly, aircraft scrambled, and armored divisions directed toward the landing zone. Time was the most valuable weapon Germany possessed. And radar was meant to provide it. Since the early years of the war, German scientists had developed sophisticated early warning radar systems capable of detecting aircraft formations far beyond the coastline. Stations equipped with Freya and Würzburg radar sets watched the skies continuously, feeding information into regional command centers. These networks had once allowed the Luftwaffe to intercept British bombers with deadly efficiency. By 1944, German commanders trusted these electronic eyes almost as much as physical fortifications. Yet the strategic situation surrounding those defenses had changed dramatically. Throughout 1943, Allied air forces launched an escalating bombing campaign against occupied Europe and Germany itself. The United States Army Air Forces conducted daylight precision bombing, while the Royal Air Force struck at night. Together, they sought not only to destroy factories and rail networks but also to erode Germany's ability to respond to a future invasion. Air superiority became the hidden prerequisite for liberation. American aircraft production surged beyond anything previously imagined. Long-range fighters such as the P-51 Mustang began escorting bombers deep into German airspace, reducing losses and forcing the Luftwaffe into exhausting defensive battles. German pilots, once experienced veterans, were increasingly replaced by hurriedly trained newcomers. Fuel shortages worsened the crisis. Each hour spent defending the Reich weakened Germany's ability to contest an invasion elsewhere. Meanwhile, Allied planners studied every mile of the French coastline. Intelligence analysts examined tides, terrain gradients, defensive layouts, and supply routes inland. The beaches of Normandy offered a combination of advantages: distance from major German armored reserves, suitable landing conditions, and the possibility of surprise if deception succeeded. Still, surprise seemed unlikely. German leadership expected an invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with strengthening coastal defenses, believed the Allies must be stopped at the water's edge. Once enemy forces established a foothold, Germany's shrinking mobility and fuel reserves would make counterattack increasingly difficult. Rommel ordered obstacles placed directly along beaches, steel hedgehogs, mines, and flooded lowlands designed to trap landing forces under artillery fire. Everything depended on warning time. Radar stations along northern France watched constantly for signs of a massive airborne or naval movement across the English Channel. Operators tracked routine bombing raids and reconnaissance flights almost daily. Patterns formed. Procedures stabilized. Confidence grew that no invasion force could approach unnoticed. But Allied commanders understood this confidence, and planned to exploit it. The coming operation, later known as Operation Overlord, required more than ships and soldiers. It demanded control of perception itself. The Germans needed to see threats where none existed, and failed to see the real one until it was too late. In the months before June 1944, an invisible contest unfolded across laboratories, airfields, and planning rooms on both sides of the Channel. Engineers refined electronic countermeasures. Intelligence officers crafted elaborate deception plans. Air commanders rehearsed coordination on a scale never attempted before. The invasion would not begin with gunfire. It would begin with confusion. And as Allied aircraft prepared for the largest airborne and bombing operation in history, a quieter battle, fought through signals, frequencies, and carefully engineered illusion, moved toward its decisive moment. Long before armies gathered along the English coast, another conflict had already begun, one fought not with bullets or bombs, but with mathematics, radio waves, and patience. By 1944, radar had transformed warfare. Nations could now see beyond darkness and weather, detecting approaching aircraft long before human eyes or ears could sense danger. Control of the electromagnetic spectrum had become as vital as control of land or sea. Germany entered the war with some of the most advanced radar technology in the world. Stations positioned along the French coastline formed overlapping detection zones designed to track aircraft crossing the English Channel. Freya radar systems provided early warning at long range, while Würzburg sets offered precise targeting information for anti-aircraft guns and night fighters. Together, they created an electronic shield intended to deny surprise. But every technology creates its countermeasure. British scientists, working since the early years of the conflict, discovered that radar depended on reflected radio waves. If enough false reflections appeared, operators could no longer distinguish real aircraft from illusion. The concept seemed simple, overwhelmed the system with echoes, yet executing it required precision engineering and careful timing. The solution became known as window, later widely called chaff, thin strips of aluminum foil cut to exact lengths corresponding to German radar frequencies. When dropped from aircraft in large quantities, these strips drifted slowly through the air, each reflecting radar signals like a phantom airplane. A single bomber could appear as dozens. Hundreds of aircraft could resemble an entire fleet. The idea was powerful but dangerous. Allied commanders initially hesitated to use it, fearing Germany might adopt the same tactic against British radar defenses. For years, both sides possessed similar concepts yet avoided deploying them fully, an unspoken technological stalemate. By 1943, necessity overcame hesitation. As preparations intensified for Operation Overlord, planners recognized that success depended on overwhelming German decision-making during the critical hours before the landings. If radar networks could be blinded or confused, German commanders might misjudge the invasion's location or delay reinforcements long enough for Allied forces to establish a foothold. Electronic warfare became inseparable from deception strategy. Parallel to technological innovation, Allied intelligence constructed one of the most elaborate misinformation campaigns in military history, Operation Fortitude. Through fake radio transmissions, inflatable tanks, double agents, and staged troop movements, the Allies convinced German intelligence that the main invasion would strike the Pas-de-Calais region rather than Normandy. The deception worked because it reinforced what German commanders already believed, that the shortest crossing from England must be the logical target. Radar deception would strengthen this illusion. Specialized aircraft units trained to drop chaff in carefully timed patterns, creating radar images resembling large naval formations moving toward false locations. Other aircraft simulated invasion fleets through coordinated flight paths, producing echoes that appeared convincing to radar operators accustomed to interpreting electronic signals as reality. Meanwhile, Allied bombers rehearsed precise navigation routes designed to strike coastal defenses, transportation networks, and communication centers simultaneously. The objective was not simply destruction. It was paralysis, forcing German command structures to confront conflicting information faster than they could verify it. German radar crews, highly trained yet dependent on technology, faced an unprecedented challenge. Their systems assumed signals reflected physical truth. They were not designed to distinguish deliberate electronic deception from genuine threats. As false echoes multiplied, certainty would vanish. Compounding the problem was Germany's deteriorating strategic situation. Allied bombing campaigns had damaged communication lines and reduced coordination between regional commands. Fuel shortages limited reconnaissance flights that might otherwise confirm radar reports. Increasing reliance on electronic warning systems made those systems a critical vulnerability. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike earlier battles of the war. On one side stood an elaborate defensive network built on detection and rapid response. On the other stood an offensive plan designed to manipulate perception itself, to make the enemy react to ghosts while real forces moved unseen through darkness. During the night of June 5 to 6, 1944, hundreds of Allied aircraft lifted from airfields across southern England. Some carried bombs. Others carried paratroopers. And many carried nothing more lethal than bundles of aluminum strips, small, weightless tools that would soon reshape the opening hours of the invasion. As engines roared into the night sky, the invisible war reached its final phase. Ahead lay dawn, and the moment when confusion in the air would determine the fate of the beaches below. Inside Allied bombers crossing the English Channel, the invasion did not feel inevitable. Crews had flown dangerous missions before, but this night carried unusual weight. Briefings had been precise yet limited. Airmen understood they were supporting the largest amphibious assault ever attempted, but many did not know the full scale of deception surrounding them. The aircraft interiors were cold and loud. Oxygen masks fogged with breath. Navigation lights remained dim to avoid detection. Pilots maintained strict formation spacing despite darkness and cloud cover, trusting instruments and training more than vision. Below them lay occupied Europe, hostile territory illuminated only by occasional anti-aircraft fire. For radar operators along the German coast, the experience was equally human but entirely different. Months of routine had conditioned them to recognize patterns: bomber streams approaching industrial targets, reconnaissance flights probing defenses. Their work required calm interpretation rather than emotion. Yet during the early hours of June 6, screens began showing anomalies that resisted familiar explanation. Signals multiplied too quickly. Contacts appeared in improbable formations. Some vanished suddenly, replaced by others further away. Operators adjusted gain controls and checked equipment repeatedly. Nothing seemed broken, yet nothing made sense. In both aircraft and bunkers, individuals relied on training while confronting uncertainty. Neither side fully understood that they were participating in a new form of warfare, one where perception itself had become a battlefield. From a tactical standpoint, Allied bombing that night was not intended solely to destroy defenses. Precision mattered less than timing and coordination. The objective was to weaken Germany's ability to respond during the invasion's first critical hours. Coastal artillery batteries, radar installations, transportation hubs, and communication nodes formed an interconnected defensive system supporting the Atlantic Wall. Destroying individual bunkers was difficult, reinforced concrete often survived even heavy bombing. Instead, planners targeted functionality, cutting telephone lines, cratering roads, disrupting command centers, and forcing defenders into isolation. Airpower operated as preparation rather than conclusion. Bombers attacked rail junctions inland to slow reinforcements. Medium bombers struck gun emplacements moments before landings. Fighter aircraft suppressed anti-aircraft positions to protect following waves. Every mission fit into a tightly synchronized timetable designed around tides and daylight. Radar confusion amplified these effects. If German commanders could not accurately determine where attacks concentrated, they risked dispersing forces across multiple false threats. Tactical success depended not on overwhelming strength at one point, but on convincing the defender that danger existed everywhere at once. Thus, bombing became psychological as much as physical, a method of shaping decisions rather than merely destroying targets. At the center of this operation stood technology evolving faster than doctrine could adapt. Radar had revolutionized defense earlier in the war, but its reliance on predictable physics created vulnerabilities once understood by adversaries. The Allied deployment of chaff transformed aircraft into instruments of electronic illusion. Thousands of aluminum strips fell slowly through the atmosphere, each reflecting radio waves independently. Radar receivers interpreted these reflections as aircraft formations, creating expanding clouds of false contacts. Unlike traditional camouflage, this deception operated at distances beyond visual confirmation. German operators saw convincing evidence of incoming forces yet lacked immediate means to verify authenticity. Aircraft scrambled toward phantom targets consumed fuel and time. Commanders receiving conflicting radar reports hesitated to commit reserves. Meanwhile, Allied navigators relied on their own advanced systems, radar mapping, radio beacons, and electronic guidance, allowing bomber formations to maintain accuracy despite darkness and weather. Technology thus served opposing roles, clarity for attackers, confusion for defenders. The significance extended beyond Normandy. For the first time on such a scale, electronic warfare directly shaped the outcome of a major invasion. Victory depended not solely on firepower but on mastery of invisible signals crossing the sky. At the highest levels of Allied command, the Normandy invasion represented a problem of synchronization unlike anything previously attempted in modern warfare. Success required naval forces, airborne troops, strategic bombers, fighters, and ground armies to operate within narrow windows defined by tides, moonlight, and weather. A delay of hours could mean catastrophic exposure on open beaches. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, understood that overwhelming force alone would not guarantee success. Germany still possessed formidable defensive capability along the French coast. The decisive advantage had to come from coordination, every element reinforcing the others at precisely the right moment. Air commanders played a central role in this design. American bomber forces were tasked not only with destruction but with shaping the battlefield before soldiers arrived. Missions were scheduled to coincide with airborne drops and naval bombardments, ensuring German defenders faced multiple crises simultaneously. Leadership decisions emphasized redundancy. If one element faltered, others would maintain pressure. Yet these decisions depended on a fragile assumption: that German commanders would misinterpret the unfolding situation long enough for Allied forces to secure landing zones. Across the Channel, German leadership struggled with internal disagreements that complicated response planning. Authority over armored reserves remained divided between field commanders and Adolf Hitler himself, whose approval was required before large counterattacks could begin. Communication delays and uncertainty would prove as damaging as physical destruction. Leadership, on both sides, became a race against time, measured not in days, but in minutes of hesitation. For German officers responsible for defending northern France, the early hours of June 6 did not immediately resemble an invasion. Radar reports indicated activity across wide stretches of coastline. Some signals suggested a major movement toward the Pas-de-Calais region, reinforcing expectations shaped by months of Allied deception under Operation Fortitude. Conflicting information arrived continuously. Coastal observers reported limited airborne activity. Radar stations detected large formations that later disappeared. Communications between sectors became strained as bombing disrupted telephone networks and command lines. German doctrine emphasized rapid concentration of forces at the invasion site. But concentration required certainty, and certainty was precisely what electronic deception removed. Commanders hesitated to redeploy divisions prematurely, fearing a secondary landing elsewhere. Reports describing unusual radar echoes were often interpreted as diversionary raids rather than the opening phase of a full-scale assault. Compounding confusion, the Luftwaffe lacked sufficient aircraft to conduct large reconnaissance missions before daylight. Fuel shortages and Allied air superiority limited German ability to verify radar information visually. Decisions therefore relied heavily on electronic data already compromised by chaff and coordinated bombing. From the German perspective, the invasion did not initially appear as a single overwhelming blow. Instead, it resembled scattered threats unfolding simultaneously, none clearly dominant. This ambiguity delayed decisive action during the most critical hours of the operation. Beyond tactics and technology, the events over Normandy demonstrated the growing importance of psychological warfare. Allied planners recognized that modern command systems depended on interpretation. Confuse interpretation, and entire defensive structures could falter without being physically destroyed. Electronic deception worked because it exploited human expectation. German commanders anticipated an invasion at Pas-de-Calais, radar signals appeared to confirm that belief. Each false echo reinforced existing assumptions, making contradictory evidence easier to dismiss. The defenders were not deceived through ignorance but through confidence in their own reasoning. Meanwhile, continuous bombing and airborne operations created sensory overload. Explosions, fragmented reports, and disrupted communications forced commanders to prioritize immediate threats while losing awareness of broader patterns. Under such conditions, hesitation became unavoidable. Psychological pressure extended to individual soldiers as well. Coastal units experienced bombardment without clear understanding of enemy strength or direction. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Some units prepared for attacks that never came, while others faced the real assault with incomplete warning. The Allies had effectively turned uncertainty into a weapon. By dawn, German defenses faced not just bombs and aircraft but a collapse of clarity. Decisions slowed. Responses fragmented. Precious hours passed as commanders attempted to separate illusion from reality. And as the first light of morning spread across the channel, the consequences of that confusion began to reveal themselves, not on radar screens, but across the skies filled with approaching bombers and the coastline awaiting impact. Shortly after 4 o'clock hours on June 6, 1944, the night over the English Channel began to change. Darkness remained, but the horizon carried the faintest suggestion of dawn. Above the water, thousands of aircraft moved in carefully organized streams, one of the largest coordinated air operations ever attempted. Engines droned in layered formation stretching for miles, each group following precise routes calculated months in advance. This was the aerial opening of Operation Overlord. American heavy bombers approached first, flying at altitude toward defensive positions guarding the coast of Normandy. Behind them came medium bombers and fighter bombers assigned to lower-level attacks. Navigation crews tracked landmarks through radar mapping systems, while electronic warfare aircraft released waves of chaff into the cold air. Thousands of aluminum strips drifted downward, spreading across the sky like invisible fog. On German radar screens, the effect was immediate. Contacts multiplied rapidly. What had once appeared as identifiable formations dissolved into vast clusters of signals extending across wide sectors of coastline. Some echoes suggested enormous fleets approaching multiple locations simultaneously. Others moved slowly or appeared stationary, defying normal aircraft behavior. Operators attempted to filter interference, but the density of reflections overwhelmed standard procedures. Reports flowed upward through command channels. Possible large-scale air movements, uncertain direction, conflicting bearings. At several radar stations, technicians suspected equipment malfunction. Checks revealed systems functioning normally, yet readings remained chaotic. The electronic shield protecting the Atlantic coast had not been destroyed, it had been blinded. Meanwhile, the bombers continued forward. American crews received final instructions over radio channels kept brief to avoid interception. Bomb bays were armed. Formation leaders adjusted altitude and speed to maintain synchronization with naval forces advancing below them across the channel. Timing mattered enormously. Bombs needed to fall minutes before amphibious forces approached the beaches, suppressing defenses without endangering incoming troops. As aircraft neared the coastline, German anti-aircraft batteries began firing into the darkness. Searchlights probed the sky, occasionally catching glimpses of silhouettes before losing them again among clouds and electronic interference. Flak bursts illuminated the air in brief flashes, revealing the scale of the incoming formations. For many German defenders, this appeared at first like another large bombing raid, severe but familiar. Similar attacks had struck France for months. Yet the volume of aircraft and the persistence of radar confusion suggested something different, something larger. Still, uncertainty remained. Commanders hesitated to declare a full invasion underway. Reports from different sectors contradicted one another. Some indicated airborne landings inland, others described naval movements detected only intermittently. Radar signals continued to suggest threats toward Pas-de-Calais, reinforcing long-held expectations shaped by Allied deception efforts. Those precious minutes allowed Allied aircraft to reach their release points largely unchallenged by coordinated fighter interception. The Luftwaffe, weakened by attrition and hampered by confusion, struggled to assemble an effective response before daylight. Inside the bombers, crews counted down to target approach. Navigators confirmed headings. Bombardiers took control as aircraft stabilized for release runs. Below them lay fortified gun batteries, bunkers, and defensive obstacles forming part of the Atlantic Wall, structures designed to repel an invasion that was now only hours away. Then the first bombs fell. Explosions rippled across coastal positions, sending columns of smoke into the early morning sky. Shockwaves rolled through defensive installations already strained by disrupted communications. Roads leading inland were cratered. Artillery positions struggled to maintain coordination as telephone lines snapped and command posts lost contact with neighboring units. The bombardment was not perfectly accurate. Cloud cover and navigation challenges caused some bombs to fall inland or miss hardened targets entirely. Yet perfection was never the objective. The cumulative effect, noise, shock, and disorientation, achieved what planners intended, defenders forced into reaction rather than preparation. As dawn approached, the scale of the assault became undeniable. More aircraft followed in successive waves, each reinforcing the sense that German defenses faced a threat beyond ordinary bombing operations. And below, hidden by darkness and distance, an armada of ships carrying tens of thousands of soldiers moved steadily toward the beaches. The sky had already changed the battle. Now the coastline itself was about to feel the full weight of that transformation. As the first light of June 6, 1944 spread across the horizon, the bombardment intensified. Smoke drifted inland from shattered positions along the coast of Normandy, blurring visibility and masking the scale of movement unfolding offshore. German defenders, emerging from bunkers shaken by explosions, struggled to understand what they were facing. Communication lines were damaged, observation posts disrupted, and radar reports still contradicted one another. For months, the Atlantic Wall had been presented as an impenetrable barrier, concrete, steel, and firepower designed to stop any invasion before it reached land. Yet its effectiveness depended on coordination, artillery directed by observation, reinforcements guided by accurate intelligence, and rapid command decisions based on reliable warning systems. That coordination was now unraveling. American bomber formations completed successive attack runs against coastal batteries positioned to fire on incoming ships. Medium bombers struck transportation routes and defensive strongpoints behind the beaches, isolating frontline units from reinforcements inland. Fighter aircraft swept low over defensive zones, targeting anti-aircraft guns and communication nodes that might organize resistance. The cumulative effect was disruption rather than total destruction. Many bunkers survived structurally, but crews inside them faced fragmented orders and limited awareness of the broader situation. Some units fired prematurely at distant targets. Others waited for confirmation that never arrived. Radar stations, overwhelmed hours earlier, failed to provide clear guidance about the true scale or location of the invasion fleet. Offshore, Allied naval forces moved into position. Battleships and cruisers opened fire, their heavy guns adding another layer of shock to already disoriented defenses. Naval bombardment synchronized with earlier air attacks, striking known artillery positions identified through aerial reconnaissance. The transition from air power to naval gunfire felt seamless, a continuous assault that denied defenders time to recover between waves. German commanders attempted to assess whether this represented the main invasion or a diversion. Reports continued referencing suspicious activity elsewhere along the coast, echoes created by electronic deception still lingering within radar networks. The possibility of a larger landing at Pas-de-Calais delayed commitment of armored reserves, exactly as Allied planners intended. Time slipped away. As landing craft approached the beaches, many coastal batteries struggled to adjust targeting quickly enough. Bombing had disrupted range-finding equipment and observation posts essential for accurate fire. Smoke and dust further obscured visibility. Defensive guns that might have inflicted devastating losses fired late or inaccurately. Above the battlefield, Allied aircraft maintained near-total control of the sky. The Luftwaffe's response remained limited and fragmented. Years of attrition, fuel shortages, and surprise reduced German ability to mount coordinated aerial resistance during the critical morning hours. Only scattered fighter sorties appeared, insufficient to challenge the overwhelming Allied presence. For soldiers inside landing craft, the results became visible even before reaching shore. Columns of smoke marked bombed strongpoints. Some artillery positions lay silent. Others fired sporadically rather than in coordinated barrages. The expected wall of synchronized defensive fire had weakened. This did not mean safety. Many beach sectors remained deadly, and casualties would still be severe. But the integrated defensive system Germany relied upon, radar warning, coordinated artillery, rapid reinforcement, had failed to function as designed. The Atlantic Wall had not collapsed through a single dramatic breach. Instead, it fractured under simultaneous pressure applied across airwaves, skies, and sea. Radar deception delayed response. Bombing disrupted coordination. Naval fire suppressed surviving resistance. Together, these elements transformed what might have been an organized defense into a series of isolated struggles. By mid-morning, Allied forces established footholds on several beaches. German command structures began realizing the magnitude of the invasion, but the decisive window had already passed. Reinforcements mobilized too late to prevent landings from solidifying. The battle that determined the fate of Normandy's beaches had begun hours earlier, not when soldiers landed, but when radar certainty vanished and bombers crossed unseen through the darkness. And as fighting spread inland, the consequences of that lost clarity started reshaping the war in Western Europe itself. By late morning on June 6, 1944, the scale of events unfolding across Normandy could no longer be mistaken for a diversion. Reports arriving at German headquarters confirmed sustained landings along multiple beaches, airborne forces operating inland, and continuous Allied air activity dominating the skies. Yet the most critical hours, those before and during dawn, had already passed beyond recovery. The immediate consequence of the radar disruption and coordinated bombing campaign was not total destruction of German defenses, but fragmentation. Units that were designed to function as parts of an integrated system now operated in isolation. Coastal batteries often lacked communication with higher command. Radar stations, though physically intact in several locations, struggled to provide reliable tracking data after hours of electronic interference. Commanders received information too late or too contradictory to support decisive action. German response timelines revealed the impact clearly. Reinforcements that might have reached landing zones during the earliest stages of the invasion were delayed by uncertainty regarding the true objective. Many senior officers continued to suspect a larger attack elsewhere, influenced by lingering effects of deception operations and misleading radar signals earlier in the night. Orders moved slowly through damaged communication networks, and confirmation required visual reconnaissance that daylight alone could finally provide. By then, Allied forces had already secured footholds. American and British bombers continued sorties throughout the morning, targeting road junctions, bridges, and rail lines leading toward the invasion area. These strikes prevented rapid movement of German reserves from deeper within France. Even units prepared to counterattack encountered blocked routes, destroyed vehicles, or constant threat from fighter aircraft patrolling overhead. Air superiority proved decisive in shaping battlefield conditions. Allied fighters maintained continuous presence above Normandy, intercepting reconnaissance aircraft and limiting the ability of German commanders to gather accurate intelligence. Without reliable aerial observation, German leadership relied on fragmented ground reports that often lagged behind reality by several hours. The Luftwaffe's limited response illustrated how dramatically the balance of power had shifted. Only small numbers of German aircraft reached the battlefield during the first day, insufficient to disrupt Allied operations or challenge bomber formations. Years earlier, concentrated German airpower might have inflicted heavy losses on invasion forces approaching open beaches. In June 1944, that capability had largely vanished. On the ground, the effects of pre-landing bombardment varied. Some fortified positions remained operational and inflicted significant casualties on attacking troops, demonstrating the resilience of reinforced defenses. However, many artillery crews reported difficulty coordinating fire due to damaged observation systems and disrupted communications, precisely the weaknesses Allied planners aimed to create. Post-battle assessments later indicated that bombing accuracy alone did not determine success. Instead, cumulative disruption played the decisive role. Radar confusion delayed warning. Bombing fractured command networks. Continuous air presence prevented recovery. Each factor reinforced the others, producing an operational paralysis disproportionate to physical destruction. German commanders gradually recognized that the invasion represented the long-anticipated Allied return to Western Europe. Emergency measures were initiated, armored divisions mobilized, and defensive strategies revised. Yet these actions unfolded under pressure created during the invasion's opening hours. A period when hesitation, uncertainty, and incomplete information shaped every decision. For Allied planners observing reports from Normandy, early indicators suggested cautious success. Despite heavy fighting on certain beaches, landings continued, reinforcements arrived steadily, and supply lines across the channel remained open. The gamble of combining electronic warfare with overwhelming air power had achieved its essential purpose, buying time. And in modern warfare, time often determines victory long before final outcomes become visible. As the first day of invasion progressed toward evening, commanders on both sides began assessing not only what had happened, but what it meant for the future course of the war in Europe. As night returned to Normandy on June 6, 1944, the immediate violence of the landings gave way to strategic realization. The invasion had succeeded in establishing a permanent Allied presence in Western Europe. German forces still held strong defensive positions inland, and the campaign ahead would be long and costly, but one reality had become undeniable: the defensive system intended to stop the invasion at the shoreline had failed at its most critical moment. The failure did not stem from lack of courage or preparation among German defenders. Many units fought with determination, and several coastal strongpoints inflicted severe casualties. Instead, the breakdown occurred at the level of coordination, the inability to transform warning into decisive action. Radar networks designed to provide clarity delivered confusion. Command structures built for rapid response hesitated under conflicting information. In the weeks following the invasion, German military analyses increasingly acknowledged the impact of Allied airpower. Continuous bombing prevented large-scale daytime movement, forcing reinforcements to travel at night under difficult conditions. Bridges and railways remained frequent targets, slowing logistical support and fragmenting counterattacks. Armored divisions that might have concentrated quickly arrived piecemeal, reducing their effectiveness against expanding Allied beachheads. The strategic implications extended far beyond Normandy itself. Air superiority demonstrated that modern warfare no longer depended solely on fortifications or numerical strength at the front line. Control of the air, and increasingly, control of electronic information, shaped outcomes before ground battles fully developed. The events surrounding Operation Overlord revealed a new principle: victory could begin with disruption rather than destruction. Electronic warfare emerged as a defining feature of future conflict. The use of chaff to confuse radar proved that advanced technology could be turned against itself. Systems designed to provide certainty could instead amplify uncertainty when manipulated skillfully. Military planners across the world studied these lessons closely after the war, recognizing that battles would increasingly involve invisible contests over detection, communication, and perception. For the Allies, the success of coordinated bombing validated years of industrial and strategic investment. American production capacity, combined with British scientific innovation, had created an operational advantage impossible for Germany to match by 1944. Aircraft numbers, trained crews, and logistical organization allowed sustained pressure that defenders could neither predict nor counter effectively. The psychological impact on German leadership was equally significant. The long-anticipated invasion had arrived not as a single identifiable blow but as a complex, multi-layered assault combining deception, technology, and overwhelming air presence. Confidence in the Atlantic Wall, once portrayed as an impenetrable shield, diminished rapidly. Defensive doctrine shifted from preventing landings to attempting containment inland, a fundamentally weaker position. Meanwhile, Allied commanders expanded operations outward from the beaches. Ports were secured, supply depots established, and additional divisions transported across the Channel in growing numbers. What began as a fragile foothold evolved into a sustained offensive that would eventually push German forces out of France entirely. Historians later observed that the decisive struggle for Normandy's success occurred during the hours when German commanders lacked clarity about what they faced. Those lost hours could never be recovered. Once Allied forces consolidated their positions, the strategic momentum of the war in Western Europe changed permanently. The dawn bombing raids and radar deception had not ended the war. But they had opened the door through which its final phase would unfold, a phase shaped by technological superiority, coordinated planning, and mastery of both physical and invisible battlefields. And as the campaign moved deeper into Europe, the meaning of that morning began to extend beyond victory or defeat, raising broader questions about how modern wars would be fought and remembered. The morning of June 6, 1944 was more than the beginning of an invasion, it was a turning point in the way wars would be fought and understood. The beaches of Normandy were the visible arena, but the decisive battle had occurred in the invisible realm of signals, frequencies, and perception. Radar screens flickered in confusion, bomber formations crossed the Channel unseen, and commanders were forced to act with incomplete information. In that space between certainty and chaos, the future of Western Europe was quietly decided. Allied forces demonstrated that success could depend as much on deception and technological mastery as on brute force. The combined use of electronic warfare, precise air power, and strategic deception created opportunities that traditional fortifications and experienced defenders could not withstand. Human courage remained vital, but it was amplified by innovation and coordination. The Atlantic Wall, long considered invincible, proved vulnerable when its assumptions were challenged and its information disrupted. The psychological dimension of the operation was equally profound. German commanders faced the tension of conflicting reports, false signals, and disrupted communications, a stress born not from combat alone but from uncertainty itself. The fog of war, once natural and unavoidable, had become a weapon in Allied hands, illustrating that mastery of perception could reshape outcomes before bullets were fired or bombs fell. In hindsight, the dawn of June 6 was not only a triumph of planning but a demonstration of a new era in warfare. Technology, intelligence, and coordination had combined to create decisive advantage. The lessons reverberated far beyond Normandy, shaping post-war military thought, strategy, and innovation. Yet at the heart of it all remained a simple truth. Victory depends on those moments when the invisible aligns with the visible, when confusion becomes opportunity, and when precision meets timing. The Atlantic Wall did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was unprepared for a war fought in the mind as much as in the field, in signals as much as in firepower. And in that quiet, early morning calculus, the Allied air campaign had already won its first, decisive victory. Long before the soldiers who would storm the beaches ever set foot on sand.